begin, and we start off with that very groundbreaking report. And the 2021 Economic Survey report has been launched by the Cabinet Secretary of the National Treasury. According to the survey, in 2020, total employment outside small-scale agriculture and pastoral activities stood at 17.4 million, down from 18.1 million recorded in 2019. Wage employment in the private sector declined by 10%. Well, let's take a listen in on that presentation by CS Yatani.
The Kenya shilling depreciated against major currencies, exchanging at Kenya shilling 106.5 for dollar, Kenya shilling 121.7 for euro, and Kenya shilling 136.7 against sterling pound, respectively. On employment and earnings, in 2020, total employment outside small-scale agriculture and pastoral activities stood at 17.4 million, down from 18.1 million recorded in 2019. Wage employment in the private sector declined by 10%, from 2,063,200 jobs in 2019 to stand at 1,856,500 jobs. Within the public sector, wage employment increased from 865,000 in 2019 to 884,000 in 2020. Informal sector employment is estimated to have contracted to 14.5 million jobs compared to 15.1 million jobs in 2019. The nominal wage bill for private and public sectors declined from Kenya shilling 2,279 billion in 2019 to Kenya shilling 2,197 billion in 2020, mainly due to a decrease of 6.6% wage bill in the private sector. Inflation rate, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, increased from 5.3% in 2019 to 5.4% in 2020. In the sector of accommodation and food services, overall, the tourism sector indicators registered a decline in tourism earnings, decreasing by 43.9% to Kenya shilling 91.7 billion in 2020. The declines were attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant containment measures by governments across the world. International visitor arrivals decreased by 71.5% to stand at 579,000 in 2020. Hotel bed night occupancy rate contracted by 58% to 3,803,000. The number of international and local conferences declined by 87% and 75.2% respectively in 2020. Visitors to national parks and game reserves declined by 65.1% to 1,037,000 in 2020.
Well, that is the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury, Ambassador Ukur, Yatani, just giving some perspectives around how the economy is performing. And one of the big conversations is the economy has been rebased. In simple terms, this is just where the economy is recalibrated to reflect how much it has grown by and which areas led to the growth and what does it mean for the country at large. Well, let's look at the numbers now. Overall performance of the domestic economy. The economy was actually rebased to 2016, and the GDP was revised, estimated at 10.753 trillion shillings. Well, the economy contracted by 0.3%, and this was linked to a disruption in labor supply. Let's take a quick look at some of the sectors. The agricultural sector was up by 4.6%. That, of course, touched on tea production, whereas horticulture earnings, I beg your pardon, were up by 3.9% to 150.2 billion shillings. Other areas of interest: environment and natural resources. Mineral production was down by 5.8% to 22.7 billion. Forest cover increased to 4.23 million hectares, and this, of course, also had a big impact on the total land, which increased to value of fisheries increased by 26.2 billion. Let's look at a very interesting area, and this is the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector was down by 0.1%, and the value of output up 2.8% from 2.3 trillion in 2019 to 2.4 trillion shillings. While total sales by EPZ enterprises were up by 4.3% to 80.5 billion shillings, and imports were down by 7.5% to 36.8 billion in 2020. An area that will be generating a lot of interest for Kenyans is formal employment sector. The sector went down by 10.3%, and a total of 316,000 jobs were lost. Another area that we want to spotlight is the building and construction sector, which was up by 11.8%. It was a good year for the construction sector. Cement consumption up by 21.3% from 6.1 million tons to 7.4 million tons. And the total length of roads under bitumen were up by 1.8% to 26,600 kilometers. Wage employment was up by 33%, this hitting about 230,500. Well, that's a quick snapshot of the numbers. We'll be revisiting them as we progress with the program. And of course, a lot of interest on the numbers, and we really look forward to your feedback on our Twitter handles at KTN News KE. You can also tweet me at Agina Abi, and of course, our hashtag is Business Today. Well, my colleague Noah Kipkimboi was keeping a close eye on this particular developing story, and he now joins us for more updates. Over to you, Noah.
Right now, you ask anybody on the street, they will tell you it's been a little bit difficult, or for some people even more difficult. And this is reflective on what is happening and what we saw in this economic survey. Remember, they're comparing the performance between the year 2019 and the year 2020. We're in the year 2021. So how was that transition, especially amidst the pandemic? First of all, this term they call GDP, gross domestic product, basically is the value of production in our country, which is from all the sectors. So you look at education. How do we value the production in education? You look at construction. All that totaled up, that is the gross domestic product. All right. And when we look at GDP and its performance in this particular economic survey, actually, as the Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani put it clearly, it contracted by 0.3% for the year 2020. That is compared to 2019, which was 5.6%. Of course, not an uncommon issue. Globally, we saw lots of contraction between that transition of 2019 to 2020 due to COVID-19 pandemic. But key is the specific sectors. How did the specific sectors perform? So we have some sectors that marked an improvement or positive location, and we also had some sectors worse hit. Talking of worse hit, we understand hospitality. It was one of the worst affected sectors in Kenya. People were not able, in terms of tourism, people were not able to come in. We had also, our hotels being closed, which was very unfortunate. So we saw a contraction of negative 47.7%, which is quite massive. Also, some other sectors that we saw a decrease is education. We saw what happened to schools. We closed schools, and even right now, the timetables that the students are using right now is totally different. You have to be very keen to be able to know that they are finishing the 2020 syllabus and whatnot. So it is quite critical. We saw the impact on education sector at negative 10.7%. Another one is transport. I mean, people are not traveling. People are working from home. Brenda, in the early days, we used to see some of our anchors also anchor from home, and this is sort of a new trend that we are seeing. Transportation was very much reduced, and we saw a decline of 7.8%. But let me take a look at the positive side in regards to productivity. Construction. I mean, construction is just an outlier, growing by 11.8%, which is quite unfamiliar. And we also saw ICT. I mean, reliance on ICT, internet, became very critical during the pandemic period. So we saw it growing by 4.8%. And in the ICT sector, it's quite interesting because in the year 2019, it was growing over 5.8% growth, but now it's going to 4.8%. But before I let you go, Brenda, one of the key issues when we talk about economic performance is about jobs and employment. And we saw quite an interesting statistic where 83% of employment are in the informal sector. And this speaks of a bigger issue. Even when you talk about revenue collection, KRA has been trying to bring in the informal sector into the taxing bracket to make sure that at least that tax net is being increased. So that is quite an interesting bit also to note in this particular, economic survey. And lastly, before I hand over to you, Brenda, we also saw exports. Imports actually increasing by hitting 1.64 trillion. So currently we are a net importer as an economy, but what people are trying to do is revamp the local scene. How can we boost exports and reduce imports? And we've seen some of the transformative agenda pushing that. Let us produce more in the country if we want to see economic prosperity. We should stop exporting jobs. This is just the iceberg of the Economic Survey Report 2021.
All right, like Noah says it's just a tip of the iceberg, a lot to unpack here on the show. Many thanks, Noah. That, of course, we did get an update from him earlier on. And we now are joined by Peter Theory, one of our reporters on the economy desk. And